Alright guys, so this is going to be my float setup for fishing jigs and my pink worms on my jig heads. So we've done a video about the fixed float setup on the center pin for really low clear water. I'm going to do, I don't know if it's out yet, at some point we're going to do my ultimate bead setup for fishing 90% of water for winter steelhead. And then we're going to have this video. I don't know what order you're seeing these in, but this is going to be my bobber and jig or bobber and pink worm setup, rigging a pink worm with a jig head. So let's get into it. So first off, you got to start with the rod, of course. And I know this is hard to see because it's my room, or it's a little spare room studio for today. So for the rod, I'm running this is, you can't see it, an Akuma Guide Select Pro 9'2", 8 to 17. It's a bait casting rod. You could run a spinning rod. Anything over 9 foot is going to be a good bobber rod. But if you can get a 9.6 to a 10.6, somewhere in there is going to be more of an average bobber rod. And anywhere in there is going to be really good. Now for fishing worms and jigs, I like to run a little bit stiffer, a little bit heavier rod, okay? And I'm going to show you why. So for those beads, a lot of times I'm using a little bit lighter leader, trying to get a better presentation. I'm using smaller, thinner bead hooks, okay? But when you pull out a jig, okay, this is the addicted jig. There's some arrow jigs in here as well. I'm going to start tying my own jigs, which is going to be pretty cool. But anyway, so you have a jig fixed on a jig head, right? It's a fixed jig head, and that hook is fixed. And most of the time, depending on the brand, these are going to be way stouter, right? The little bead hook's going to be a lot lighter wire, easier to bend out. We're running lighter line. But these jigs are going to be, they're going to have a really stout hook. A lot of times it's a thicker, like 2x strong, stout hook on there. And there's two reasons for that. One is because you want to stick these fish, right? A jig, much different than a bead, whereas the bead, they're eating the bead and then you're pulling that hook in their mouth. This, they're coming up and they're eating the actual hook, and it's all fixed. So when you set the hook, it's all that hook going straight into, most of the time, the roof of the mouth is where you hook them, right? They come down like this and it's straight up into the roof of the mouth. And usually when you hook them on a jig or the pink worm jig head, those fish are not going anywhere. It's a stouter hook. It's a little bit bigger hook. So that being said, I'll run a little bit stiffer rod. My bead rods are going to be the longer 10.6 to, my center pin's 13 feet long. And there's some brands that make a spinning rod that long. And it's going to be like that 6 to 12 or like 6 to 10 pound rating, right? A lot more noodly of a rod, okay? You don't need all that backbone on these little bead hooks and those long bead leaders. But with this, to bury that jig hook in there, right, I want a little bit stiffer rod and I want to hit these fish hard. When that bobber goes down, I want to pick up line quick, which is why I like using a bait caster, fast gear ratio reel. Pick up line quick and hit those fish hard with that fixed jig head and really stick that jig in there. So I like a little bit shorter, stiffer rod. Obviously, still over 9 feet. Just a 9'2" rod, but something that's got a little more backbone. That 8 to 17, that 10 to 20, something you could even fish more for salmon. It will translate over to bobber and jig style fishing. So I've got a setup here, and I'm going to cut this off and show you how I rig it really fast. So I've got braided line on here. When I'm running my bait cast and spinning setups, I go straight braided line on here. Again, this is not a finesse technique like the bead. This is a heavier technique. And I like to fish just straight braid coming off my reel. And I'll add on, I guess I didn't need to clip my bobber stop off. That was kind of dumb. So now I got to get a new bobber stop out. All right, so to my bobber stop, you guys have probably all seen, I like to use these ones. You run your line through the wire, slide them up. So I'm going to go ahead and do that really quick. These bobber stops, a lot of them will come with, when you buy a bobber, you can also just buy the packs. Or if you look sometimes on Amazon or other, little websites, you can find just like packs. Like I found an Amazon pack that had like 200 of those in them. So I set for a while. So slide that up. Then I'm gonna slide my bead to protect that. Okay, so I like to run a little chartreuse bead up there. You can also run a corky. That way you can see and make sure that everything is fishing. But I usually just run a bead. Then I'm gonna run my float. Now, for float, it really doesn't matter a whole lot. I like these ones from Aerofloat, AF5s. I think they're pretty sensitive and they track in the water really well. Slide that on there. Okay. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to slide a little bead underneath of that to protect my knot and my bobber. Okay, so I have a bead underneath of that, and that's going to protect so my knot and my swivel doesn't jam up in there. Then I'm just going to tie on a weight to balance this out. Now, this is a 1/2 ounce float, so I'm going to go ahead and put what's on here? A 3/8 or a 1/2 ounce? Let's go with a 1/2 ounce weight. Now, you got to be careful because most of these jig heads you're fishing, the most common size is going to be to fish a 1/8 ounce jig head. A 1/4 ounce is also, one that's popular, but most of my jig heads are going to be in the 1/8 ounce. So if you wanted, you could kind of, you could account for that by running a little bit lighter bobber weight to really match that perfect 1/2 ounce. But I just go ahead and match it because with these foam floats, what you'll notice a lot of times is that they float really good, even when you match them to the exact weight. So this is a 1/2 ounce float. If I put this 1/2 ounce weight underneath of it, it can still hold a 1/4 ounce jig under it, plenty. It's not going to really affect it. Whereas some brands of floats, if you run a 1/2 ounce float and a 1/2 ounce weight, it's going to run it so high that you can't put any other weight or it's going to pull it down. But these foam ones, they can hold a lot more than what they say. So I match it with a 1/2 ounce bobber weight on there. Make sure that knot's nice and good. Okay. And this is just an inline weight. So that way, when I'm fishing, it's kind of all in line. Okay. Then I tie a leader off this other end, which has a piece of braid on it because I used this one. Okay. Clip that off there. That was from a different time. So I have my braided line, main line on one side. Now I'm going to take a leader. Now, when I fish worms and jigs, I like to run heavier. So I run a 12 or a 15, even a 20-pound leader sometimes, because I'm not really worried as much, especially with a bigger pink worm. I'm not really worried that much about the fish seeing this line because it's such a big, bulky presentation. Now, if I were to size down to like a little 16th ounce jig and trim it up all nice, I might run a little bit lighter leader, just if I'm trying to be finesse in low, clear water. But a lot of times when I'm fishing jigs and in your bright pink worms, I'm trying to get those fish's attention, right? It's a little bit bigger, brighter, bulkier. I'm trying to get those fish to see that and draw in and to really focus on this big presentation. And I feel like the line is not really going to scare them off. So I'm going to run 12 pound right now, but I will run 15 or 20 pound on here a lot. I won't be afraid to do that. So I got to grab my worms. I had my jig box in front and not my worm box. So got my worm box here. I've got just an assortment of colors of worms. And the biggest thing with worms and jigs is to try to be a little bit different. Okay, now we all know a nightmare jig is killer, right? That like black, red, and white is a killer, subtle little jig, okay? We also know, especially from you guys watching Addicted Fishing, that I don't even have one in here. This is kind of close, that like the red haze worms work well. This is more of that Captain America, kind of pink with the blue tail, but like that red haze or kind of reddish, the JP Wet Dream, the kind of reddish worm with the white tail, right? We all know that's a really good worm. It's a really good color, just like the nightmare jig is. But if you look at 90% of anglers that are fishing worms or jigs, that's what they're going to have tied on. So I try not to fish them too much. You know, if I've got a river to myself and there's not a lot of other people around, or mostly people fishing beads, then I'll run that nightmare jig or that, you know, that white-tailed kind of red worm. But actually, here you go. This is more what I'm talking about. That like JP Wet Dream, I think it's called, by WFO. That more like reddish body, white tail, very popular, okay? But everyone's running that. So what I try to do is I try to be different, and I try to be bold, right? I want to stand out. I don't want to, this is not a finesse technique for me. I'm not trying to match the hatch like you are with a bead. I'm trying to stand out and get those fish to react to it. So I like to fish my brighter colors, right? This is one of my favorites. This Addicted makes this worm. I call it the popsicle. I don't know what they actually call it. They have a name for it, but I always call it the popsicle. It's like this pink color, like a sherbet orange tail on there. And I'll throw either like a chartreuse head on there or a blue head, something with a lot of contrast. And now when you're going behind people that are fishing a lot of beads or like the simple nightmare jigs, the simple little red worms, right? I go behind them and fish something like this. And it's just to kind of get those fish pissed off, really. Get those fish to react to it. And they've never seen that combination before because everyone else is fishing the natural worms. And I do have the natural worms and the natural jigs. There is times and place for that. But a lot of times I'm trying to be different out there. So, you know, I'm going steelhead fishing tomorrow, early winter steelhead. These fish that are first coming in usually are going to be aggressive because they haven't seen much. I'm going to go ahead and tie on this guy right here. And for the length on my worms, I like to run about a 4 to 5 inch worm. A lot of worms will come that 6-inch worm. And if I want to be really aggressive or the water's higher, I'll run that whole 6-inch worm, or if I'm targeting big steelhead particular. But most of the time I'll cut it down to like that 4 or 5 inch size. So all I'm going to do is take my leader here, and I cut off about 3 feet. And you can go, you know, I'll go down to like a foot, anywhere from a foot to about 3 feet. The shorter leader, the more control you're going to have. So I'm going to tie this on really quick, and I'll kind of tell you what I'm talking about here. All right, so I tied on that leader onto my worm there, and then I tied the other end to that weight, the swivel on there. And so what you're going to do, like I said, I run this leader here anywhere from a foot to about 3 feet long. And you got to keep in mind that the longer this leader is, the less control you're going to have. This is your main bobber weight. So this is going to be what anchors that worm down in the river, right? When you cast out, this is what's going to fall down and kind of anchor yourself and get that steady drift, okay? So the longer you have this leader, the more this worm is going to be able to catch different currents and swing away, okay? Now, sometimes that's a good thing because sometimes it gives the worm more action, more freedom to move around. But sometimes that can be a bad thing because you want this worm in the strike zone and you want this worm to come down, you want these fish to be sitting, and you want this worm to come down right in front of those fish. So if this leader is too long and you have too boily water or too fast of water, sometimes this weight will be coming down like this and this worm will be pushed off to the side. So this weight is going to be in line with where the fish are at, but this worm could be kicked off and it's not down there where the fish are. So when I've got those higher water conditions, faster water conditions, big, deeper, boily water, when I need that worm to get down, number one, that's when I go up to a 1/4 ounce jig head instead of the 1/8 ounce jig head. And number two, I'll shorten up that leader so that way that worm has less line to wander away from that main bobber weight. So hopefully that made sense to you guys. I know this isn't super in depth, but it's just a quick rigging. And that's how I do my worms and my jigs. And same thing with the jigs. As color I talked about, I try to be different. try to throw those bigger, brighter, bold presentations. Now, I'm not doing that right away. I'm not going to go down to the river first thing at light, be the first person at the hole and cast something like that in there. Because a lot of times, if those fish haven't seen anything else and you throw that in there, you could spook those fish really easily. I'm fishing this when I get off work and I run to the river for an hour and it's been pounded on all day. Or I've already fished. I fished my bead setups and maybe my finesse jig setup through there and didn't get anything, or maybe pulled 1 or 2 fish out, but I know there's more in there. That's when I'm going to go ahead and run this through. So I always carry multiple rods, always have my little bead rod with me where I'm running my more natural beads, and then my cleanup rod is going to be throwing something like that through there. And you'd be surprised how many times you'd fish a hole with beads or with your smaller nightmare jigs, and then you throw on a bigger, brighter jig or a weird colored jig or a bigger, brighter worm and pull out a nice fish that you wouldn't have caught if you would have just kept throwing a natural presentation. So anyway, hope you guys learned something here, and hope you're having a great day. Get out there and slay some steelhead.